Hi, and welcome to the session. The first part of this lesson is a bit of an emotional, developmental one, if you will. If that's not your jam, cool. You can go to the timestamp somewhere around here and start the main lesson. If you're here for all of it, let's sit down together and talk about pigeons. In this session, we're going to be using a pigeon as a trigger or metaphor for noticing the luminous, iridescent in the mundane. Before we continue, I'd like to show you the pigeons that I keep on talking about. They're little paper pigeons with mixed media, and they have articulated wings, which means the wings move. I'm going to show you how to make one pigeon, and you can easily translate the techniques that you use into making an entire flock. Pigeons are common, and I feel that lots of us don't notice them because they're grey, short, small, they're walking on the floor. But if you have the time to sit and notice pigeons, you will see that besides being hilarious, they have wonderful colouring and patterns on their bodies. The rock pigeon, which is inspiration for these pigeons, has purple and green patterns of iridescence. As I got older and understood that it was about light refracting, it really ignited a curiosity in me. And that's what I would like to invoke in this lesson, that we would take an object, subject, or relationship that is common, mundane, and we notice it, and we notice something that is cool or iridescent or luminous about it. And that can either spark curiosity in us, or if no curiosity, maybe a sense of amazement. Wow, that's cool. And maybe these things will lead to gratitude. And I do want to be explicit. I am not asking you to feel gratitude if you don't feel grateful. And this is not something that is being forced in this lesson. This lesson is purely about noticing, and then maybe, if you're led, curiosity, amazement, and gratitude if it comes. I have a set of journal questions that you can go through once you've chosen your object, subject, or if it feels comfortable to you, relationship. And I'm going to take you through some of those questions now as I tell you about the magic of this little bottle. This little bottle I find to be amazing because of the technology that's inside. It allows me to drop water at the press of the nozzle, and it disperses fine water droplets. That's pretty cool. If I wanted to, I could be curious about how that technology works, or I could just say, that's cool, I'm grateful that I have it, or I'm grateful that I get to experience that technology. The second aspect of it is I understand what this object does or performs for me in my daily life. I use this to wet my palette when I'm using acrylics, which is daily, almost daily. And I know that this specific bottle has increased my comfort in my practice and increased the longevity of my paint. I know that my practice actually got better when I got this bottle. If I look at the relationship aspect that's tied into this bottle, I got this bottle from my aunt, my favorite aunt. And I remember the day we were together and she gave this to me. It was the last time I saw her. I was leaving home to come back to Poland. She had something in her pocket, this. It had scent in it, and she gave it to me. It was such a sweet gesture. I think it's more sweet to remember the actual events that I got this bottle, the actual emotions that we had between us. It wasn't all wonderful. We were a bit sad, but it was a wonderful moment. It was a wonderful gesture, and it really sticks with me. So when I become aware of this bottle when I use it, I usually think of my aunt, and I usually think of how it expanded my art practice. So that's how you could approach the questions. You can make it as micro as possible or as macro as possible, whichever works for you. After you've done your journaling, you may want to cement this into the actual pigeon you create. You could do that by writing on the pigeon prior to painting it about what you experienced when you did the journaling or when you did your thinking. You could also do little symbols on the actual pigeon when you're doing the doodling. You could do that, and when you look at your pigeon, when you notice your pigeon in your art journal, wherever you may keep it, you will understand what it's about. If those things are too vague and you really need to remember and you need something written down, we leave the back of our pigeons blank in this lesson, and you are more than welcome to write it down with the date, how you felt, how the lesson made you feel, all the information you need. You can put it, it's quite a big pigeon, at the back of this pigeon. Thank you so much for sitting through this part of the session. I hope you found it helpful. We're now on to the really fun part, which is creating our pigeons. I've printed and cut out template number 1. I'm using a Stabilo All pencil to trace around the template. You can use any pencil or watercolor pencil to do this. When using this kind of template, the one you trace around instead of on top of, remember that your final product will always be a little bit bigger than the actual template. I'm using a neutral grey straight out of the tube to paint the base coat of my pigeon. I'm also using a rounded full bit brush. You can mix black or use black and white to get a grey. I'm wetting the paper because I have a very dry room that I work in, and this will increase the workability of my paint, the flow. When I paint, my goal is not merely to cover what is under the template or the area that I need to paint. It's also to use the strokes that I make to give the bird some directionality. The feathers on the head are going around in a round fashion, while the feathers on the body are going according to the shape of the body, and then I'm trying to denote the wing. My paint is also applied fairly thickly, so you can see the strokes that I'm putting on. You can see the brush marks in the paint. When painting the wing, I use the same logic. I'm trying to create directionality when I use my brush, and I want this to guide my later strokes. For this current base coat, I'm going to leave his shoes undone. I now have titanium white and Mars black on my palette. The titanium white really looks like pigeon offerings. I'm going to use the same brush that I used earlier to create feathers on the body of the pigeon. I'm making sure that my brush is relatively clean because I'm going to dip into the white first. It's your choice which color you want to use. I just like using white first because it's quite outstanding against the gray, and I don't have to clean my brush as much as if I was using black and then dipped into other colors. Take note that I'm following one directionality when I'm painting a feather. I'm moving in an upward fashion, similar to how feathers are laid out, with the broad end at the bottom and the smaller end at the top. I also want to make sure that I've got the smaller tip of the wing as the bottom of my wing, and that's why I've decided to paint it this way. You could do it any way, because these pigeons are quirky and offbeat. It doesn't really look bad or affect the final result if you decided to paint your strokes the other way. I'm not painting everything white. I'm placing the white strokes sporadically. I'm leaving some of the grey showing. I want it to look similar to how a pigeon is patterned, not exactly the same. The pigeon is inspiration in this case. You can use some pigeon pictures, and you can put your white and your black wherever you feel looks good. If you wanted, you could also paint the entire wing white or entirely black or a different type of grey. I hope you can see that I'm always trying to use a similar direction in my stroke. It really makes the wings look like they have some type of feather on it. My boots are not filled in precisely as yet, just putting in some color. we're going to very casually mix a darker value of grey, which means we've just put some black paint into the grey. I'm painting the rest of the pigeon quite roughly. I want bold brush strokes and tidy brush strokes, and I'm using this as texture. If you need some guidance on what kind of brush strokes you can use in this particular part of the exercise, there is a PDF that explains feather shapes and stippling and working on the edge of your brush, etc. I make sure that my pigeon is looking less generic or less one coat. I'm trying to add more layers, and I'm doing this all in one go. The paint is wet, the paint is mixing, and I don't have any particular desire at the moment for where I want darker values or lighter values, but I do have an idea that I just want sections to look different from each other. I want his belly to look different from his head, from his legs. My paint is applied quite thick. You would call this impasto in some cases, and this means it will take some time to dry. Acrylic does dry quite quickly. I would advise that you allow it sufficient time to dry so that when you move on to the next step, you're not necessarily pushing paint around or lifting it up. It's now time to add some color to our pigeon, and we're going to use water-soluble crayons in this case to do it. You could also use oil pastels. I'm deciding to go for a theme off the cuff here. I start with pink and I make some dots on the head. I try to keep my dots in uneven numbers, it just looks more attractive. And when I get to the belly or to the breast, I make some more dots and I just scribble. You don't have to be as random or as jagged. I enjoy this look. I feel it's a little bit more grungy, it's a little bit more rough and textured. That's why I do it this way. You could definitely use a smoother stroke. You could definitely use a different pattern. But I like this. I think it looks very fun. And my favorite part is it's really easy to do. It's just a scribble and it feels very freeing. The off-the-cuff color scheme I went for was jade, pink and blue. You can use whatever you want. And there are also some color scheme ideas in the accompanying PDF for this lesson. On my palette, I've got white acrylic ink and black acrylic ink. You can use high flow paint for this, or you can also use your white or black acrylic really watered down. I'm going to splatter the pigeon by using a little round brush, dipping it in, and then tapping it to release the droplets onto the pigeon. Depending on how much I load my brush and how hard I tap the brush, I can release different amounts of paint. I want to make sure that I get it on the feathers, on the black spots especially, and if I want little spots of white, I use my finger and I gently release the head of the brush. The size of the brush does matter, so experiment a little bit on a scrap piece of paper if you aren't too sure about this bit. When I use black, I'm a little bit more sparing, I'm a little bit more gentle, and I spat that a little more carefully. It's just because black is a very strong color, but as soon as I put the black on, in my eyes, it really helps grungify the pigeon. We're also going to use the acrylic ink to make additional larger spots on the pigeon, on the wings, in places where we feel the pigeon could benefit from it. And I feel that it usually benefits around the head where the dots already exist, or in other places where you can use the white to draw your eye to that area. Something else we're going to do is we're going to use the black or white acrylic to make some white spots or black spots on the feathers. This is not really a natural occurring thing. You do see it in pigeons, but not the way I'm doing it here. Just remember, this is a fantasy pigeon, whimsical, offbeat. So we have artistic license here. You can also make these spots and dots with heavy body acrylic. Here I'm showing you that you can use heavy body acrylic to do so. Just remember, you might need to thin it, or if you don't, when you're doing spots, you really need to let it dry. While I'm here, I see that I have acrylic ink left over, and I'm going to use that to refine the boots. You can use whatever colors left on your palette. I kind of like the acrylic ink because it is a little bit shiny when it dries, and I mean, boots are shiny, at least where I come from. I quickly take a white water-soluble crayon and I draw on some stocking lines. You can choose to do this however you want, but I do kind of smiley shapes just to give the leg some dimension. And after I do some white stripes, I go in with whatever color I want. And today it's going to be jade or teal because I really love this color. I also really wish I had socks like these. It's time to doodle a little bit. I'm using a white acrylic marker and I'm going to do some asemic writing, so writing or scribbling which represents words but aren't really words. And I'm just writing some of the things, the letters of the things that I'm grateful for. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to decorate his little booties. And today I'm just going for a simple 3-button. You can use hearts, you can use stars. Maybe you're not having boots, maybe it's just actual pigeon feet, in which case you could just use some dots, color his nails if you want, or leave it as is. I'm now going back with my water-soluble crayon, and you can see here that my paint wasn't dry, and I'm actually showing you how it came off on the crayon. So either go to drier parts or wait for it to dry, but use the water-soluble crayons just to give some accents and dimension to the feather, kind of map it out. And in this section, you'll see the usefulness of using one stroke and one direction to make your feathers, because it will generally be where your crayon goes against. I don't just make feather shapes, I also make lines. You can do whatever doodle you want to do here. You might even just write words. I like these shapes, I feel they flow easily from my fingers and my hands. And I feel it makes my pigeon have some extra pizzazz, if I can be so bold to say. I also like to use my white acrylic pen to go back over my feathers. It just adds a thinner line than the crayon and it adds more interest. You can also do this with black acrylic marker. Once again, I find the black a little bit strong for my personal preference, but it might work really well if you had a full white feather or full grey. It really is up to you, and it really is your preference. So let us release our pigeon from this paper, aka cut it. And I would like to say that cutting can be very useful in terms of cutting out what you don't like and also shaping your pigeon. I prefer my heads to be angular but rounded. So in all the templates you'll see that I've got quite angular and sharp shapes, but the edges are rounded. And I feel that adds to the look of my pigeons. They're a bit quirky. You can change that, of course, but I also feel it's easier to cut out of thicker board when you have shapes that are not necessarily round. If you're using something like cardboard, this might be very difficult using a pair of craft scissors. You might need heavy duty scissors, or you could use a craft knife. In order to cut the legs, which give me the most difficulty because they're quite close together, I usually leave them for last. And if I'm really struggling with the curve between his belly and the legs, I use a craft knife. I would advise at this stage that you keep the offcuts. You can use them in some other projects, but we definitely will be using some of them to make some eyes and a beak for the pigeon a little bit later. You can cut your feather back to the original shape, which was a little bit more angular without these feathered edges, or you can go over what you've done. It's totally up to you. I like keeping the feathered edges. Again, I feel it looks a little bit more whimsical, a little bit more fancy even. We can now play around just a little bit and see what kind of orientation we want with the two feathers that we've just made. You could put it at the front where it can swing around, or you could put it at the back where you could swing it up and behind. You could also decide that you don't want it to swing at all and you want to stick it fast. This little piece that I'm inserting here is usually a tail feather, and I usually put it at the back and behind the pigeon, and I can either stick it down or articulate it so it can swing about. But today I'm not so sure if I want to repeat that kind of move. I want to get a little bit creative with it, and that might mean doing some silly things like moving it to the top of the head. It kind of looks like a bunny rabbit, so that's cool. I've never done that before. Eventually, I decide that I will put it behind the pigeon, and as always, when I place the wings, I do move it about because I want to see if I articulate it, what kind of movement will I get, what kind of looks will I get. And it was at this point that I decided I would not articulate that particular wing, and I would just keep the front one articulated. It's okay to articulate all of them or none of them, it really is up to you. I just really enjoy the movement. It's now time to make the eyes. I'm using a stencil to draw 2 circles. I have included some circle templates in the downloads just in case you don't have a stencil. And the particular size I'm using now is a size number 13. Freehanding these circles is totally acceptable. When I cut them out, I don't cut them out as perfect circles. I like the wonky look. We're also going to draw a beak, which is just a triangle. And in your PDF again, there are templates if you want some guidance on a beak. I'm using acrylic ink, the black acrylic ink I had left over to fill this beak in. Whatever black you might have available, or maybe even a dark gray on your palette, feel free to use that. This is quite a large beak, and that's okay, we can cut it down. I find it easier to cut a beak down than have to paint a new one, although it is just a triangle. I'm using a marker for my first base coat of orange. It's a little bit brighter than the one I'm going to put on afterwards. And I'm not really concerned in filling in the circle perfectly. Again, wonky, I'm not going to cut out a perfect circle, so I behave in that way. Quick tip, it's not a life hack. I use the paint inside the top of my tubes because I don't want to pour out a lot to make the eyeballs. So I just dip it into the top, close my tube back up, and my eyeballs are not perfect circles. Again, wonk factor. The red that I'm coming in with is from a Posca pen. You could use acrylic. And I'm drawing some wonky circles around the black pupil that I've just made. It's just 2 circles overlapping, and I do have some close-up shots again in the PDF walkthrough that's provided for you. But I will also try and give you a close-up of what they look like. Go in with my second coat of orange You can adjust the pupils now if you'd like. Do it very roughly, let some of the red show through and the previous orange. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to use Titanate Yellow and I'm going to add some highlights to the eyes. And these can be used sparingly or not. It's just some spots of like glitter and glamour inside the eye, and it's something you see in birds' eyes and fish eyes, and I really enjoy it, and that's why I'm using it here. I'm now taking a Tombow marker just to add some more red into the eye. It's just to give it a bit more of a crazy look, and it also adds dimension and depth. I then come in with some white to add some catch lights to the eye, and I try and keep them in a similar position in both eyes. I also take the white and I scratch quite roughly on the beak. I'm just trying to add some interest. And if I overdo it, which you will see me do, acrylic, remember, is very forgiving. You can paint over it. So I will just go back and adjust that with some black acrylic. Make sure that your eyes and your beak are really dry before you cut them out. If you're using thicker paper, these are smaller parts and they might be more difficult to cut out, so you could use a craft knife or you could paint it on thinner watercolor paper. When I cut the eyes out, I'm not trying to be too accurate. Something that might be really cool to try, though I haven't tried it yet, is cutting out squares for eyes instead of circles. And I think that the entire offbeat wonkiness of this pigeon lends nicely to you not having to be too accurate when you do your cutting. Definitely my favorite part of the exercise, which is assembling my pigeon's face. This is where the character happens, where the quirks happen. You can decide if he's someone that's offended or someone that's caught in, I don't know, doing something naughty, someone that is just crazy, or just a general pigeon. I'm sure you're very tired of hearing me say this, but in the guided PDF, I've got a couple of examples of how you can assemble the eyes to give it some character and some quirk, how assembling the eyes can change the position of the pigeon. And I think that the most interesting thing for you to do would be to play with it by yourself and decide. Another thing you could do is hang the eyes off the edges. I like putting my eyes relatively close to the neckline, and I also like my eyes not to be in a straight line. I like one to be higher than the other, but we'll see where we go today. Having decided on a placement that makes me feel happy, it's time to stick it down. I'm going to use soft gel medium. It's on my finger. You could use a brush to apply it, and you could also use some standard glue if that's what you had available. If you find yourself in a position where you don't have any glue or gloss medium, you could use your acrylic paint to stick these parts down. Just don't use too much, because when you press down it would leak out from underneath and then cause that color to show on your pigeon. Whereas glue and gloss gel medium usually dries clear. Other ideas that might interest you is sticking more than 2 eyes on your pigeon. Why not make it a 3-eyed pigeon? Now that I've attached the facial features, it's time for me to attach the back wing. You might have to get comfortable with covering up some of your design. That little tab on the back wing is mostly what will be covered, but I am covering a section that I painted too. Your gel medium will need some time to dry. Until it's dry, you can either tear the paper off or remove the paper that you have stuck on completely. I am not sticking down this wing. You are welcome to in whichever position you like, but I'm going to turn this into an articulated pigeon. So that means I'm going to insert a Brad's pin, which is a metal pin or fastener, into the pigeon's wing joint. I've placed my pigeon on a cutting board because I'm going to use a sharp tool. I'm using an awl in this case to punch a hole in both the wing and the body of the pigeon. I once again make sure that my wing will be swinging comfortably and it looks good in the position that it's swinging in. I might decide to move it a bit lower. And then I'm going to take this awl and I'm going to punch through both cards. If you don't have an awl, you could use a thick knitting needle or needle and use that to punch a hole in either the wing and then the body, or both at the same time. You could also use a really thin pair of scissors, just the tip. If you do have something that's very thin and sharp, once again, make sure you're using it on top of a cutting mat, and please watch out for your fingers. I'm using a mini Brad's pin, which is very small. Dimensions are on the screen, and I'm going to insert it through the wing and then through the body, and once I have that through, I'm going to open it up at the back. And there's our pigeon. He's almost done. There are some finishing touches, but he's basically complete. He has a wing that moves, he has that lovely little fluffy flare at the back, and in order to finish this pigeon, there's just a couple more things you could do. One is use a white acrylic marker just to make some lines and outlines around the eye. It just makes it look like it has a lens. It makes it look a little bit larger, adds more character to the eyes. You could also use your marker and scribble a little bit more, or your water-soluble crayons and add more texture to the body. Something else you may want to do is use a black acrylic pen or some black marker, something dark, to edge the outer side of the pigeon. It gives it a more refined look, especially if you're hanging it up and might be viewing it from below, but it's not necessary. It's really up to you. And here we have our little quirky, offbeat, wonky, sassy pigeon. He looks grungy, he looks colorful, he looks cute, and I really hope you make an entire flock of these. They look absolutely wonderful in a group, and if you want any ideas on how to make accessories or how to mix blacks or grays, remember there's lots of additional information in the PDF attached and freebies to help you in that journey. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I really hope you would share it with me if you have on social media. I would be overjoyed beyond comprehension if you shared one of your wonky pigeons with me. Thank you for your time. Bye!